As with many of Capcom's past games, the first installment in the Onimusha franchise, Onimusha Warlords, had a beta version that was sought after by the franchise's fans. In this case, Onimusha Warlords, a PlayStation 2 and eventually Xbox game, had a beta version that was for a previous generation of console, the PlayStation 1. This beta version, dubbed Onimusha Demon Warrior, was about 50% complete by the time Capcom decided to move production to the PlayStation 2. While the general consensus is that Demon Warrior was not all that different from Warlords, I feel that the video footage and articles that I've seen paint a somewhat different picture. What if I told you that Onimusha, in its Demon Warrior form, had either extra boss fights or alternative boss fights? During my first viewing of a trailer for Onimusha's PS1 version, I was taken by surprise by what appeared to be the beginning of a whole boss fight unique to this version of the game. Because this boss character was big, and because he seemed to be wielding a large staff of some sort, the first time I binge-watched the various footage available for Onimusha Demon Warrior, I assumed that this character must be based off of Benkei, a character described within the Tale of the Heike, an 11th century novel that was loosely based on historical events. Indeed, like Benkei, based on the brief glimpse of concept art in the trailer, and the character's design within the game, he looks very much like a Sohei, a type of warrior monk who were known for participating in various battles throughout Japan's history of warfare, and who once held considerable political and military power in ancient Japan. Considering what game we're talking about, it helps that one of the names given to Benkei is Oni Wakamaru, Demon Child. However, after I joined the Onimusha fan Discord, I heard from two people, Murad58, a YouTuber, and JURS, an Onimusha fan on Discord, that this boss character was most likely Sougen. In the released version of Onimusha Warlords, Sougen is mentioned within a few of a series of documents having to do with a monk and his apprentice attempting to contain the demon threat at Inabayama Castle, which today is known as Gifu Castle, only for things to go disastrously wrong for the both of them. Sougen, the senior monk, is mortally wounded during one of the skirmishes, and his apprentice, Saimyo, is ultimately tasked with taking possession of a jewel and an important scroll, as Sougen prepares to use his own body as a sacrifice to try and seal the demons away. Later, in Onimusha Blade Warriors, it is mentioned that Sougen was an Oni warrior, and that he fought alongside Marcellus, originally an Oni warrior himself, 100 years before the events of Onimusha Warlords, during an event known as the Oni War. If this boss character in Onimusha Demon Warrior really is Sougen, his ultimately heroic portrayal in Onimusha Warlords and Blade Warriors seems to contrast with his depiction in Demon Warrior. After all, this potential version of Sougen is trying to kill you. But what if, when Sougen was injured, he was dragged off to be experimented on by the genius Genma, Guildenstern? In the painting for Saimyo's second journal entry, we even see a picture of a large Genma seemingly dragging Sougen away from his apprentice. If there was an equivalent to Saimyo's journal in Onimusha Demon Warrior, it could have gone about very differently to the version from Onimusha Warlords. In the released version of Saimyo's diary entries, Saimyo is a self-admitted coward, a guilt-ridden figure who eventually musters up the strength to solve an important mystery of the Genma, the knowledge of which the player ultimately uses to progress through a late stage of the game. Maybe in the original version, Saimyo regrets his supposed cowardice and failure to save his master's life, only to have a frightening encounter with him later, when he witnesses his master in his new form. If it's true that an early version of Sougen was experimented on by Guildenstern, he would share a similar fate to Marcellus. Maybe part of Marcellus's backstory was taken from Sougen's early backstory. The idea of a monk being experimented on and growing larger and stronger as a result is also similar to Muga, one of the villains of Konami's Soul of the Samurai. What follows will be my attempt at making a reconstruction of the fight, using what footage is available. At some point, Samanosuke reaches this room. I don't know what equivalent to this room there is in the released version of the first Onimusha, or if there even is an equivalent. But at some point, Samanosuke enters this room and is attacked by zombie Genma. Eventually, the far wall of the room explodes, taking down one of the Genma. Sougen enters the room, smashing the fallen Genma underfoot and telling the other Genma to "Doke" out of his way. After this, either the fight ensues or Sougen chases after Samanosuke, similar to how Nemesis chases after Jill in Resident Evil 3. From here, the boss fight starts. As you can see, Sougen seems to use electric attacks with his staff. When Samanosuke does enough damage to end the fight, Sougen charges at him, and the two recreate the classic two swordsmen run past each other and one dies from getting his stomach cut open trope. With all this in mind, assuming that this giant fighting monk really is our first boss, that would mean that he is the PS1 equivalent of Osric. His giant size, and what little we see of his personality in the released footage for Onimusha Demon Warrior, does not seem all that far from the giant, brash, war club-wielding demon we see in Warlords. As shown by Reds, another YouTuber, hidden in the code of Onimusha Warlords are up-resed versions of rooms and areas seen in the PS1 version of the game, which ultimately went unused when the Onimusha project moved to the PS2. In two of these areas, an outside corridor and what looks to be an armory, there seems to be evidence of Sougen breaking through the ground to reach different areas of the castle, which is the same thing Osric did when he transported Princess Yuki to Gifu Castle. It could be that these holes in the ground really are from Osric, and that these areas from the PS1 version of the game were simply being retooled for Osric, and various other plot elements that were introduced in the PS2 version. But if that was not the case, the idea of Sougen traveling underground, being carried over for his use in Osric's story, would strengthen the links between Sougen and Osric even more. Now, you might ask, how can I know that Sougen is the first boss fight of Onimusha's PS1 version? If you'll make note, at no point during any of the available footage of the Sougen boss fight does Samanosuke have any of the elemental weapons equipped. While it could be that they just weren't programmed into the build of the game shown in those parts of the trailer, there is footage of the elemental weapons working in other parts of the trailer, and the various E3 footage. That said, I'm not sure how common it is to make a trailer out of multiple builds of a game. Either way, there could be another possibility. As mentioned earlier, Sougen seems to wield an electric staff. In Onimusha Warlords, the first elemental weapon that Samanosuke finds is an electric sword, Ryzan. And as with each of the other elemental weapons, Ryzan is initially found in the form of an orb, Shiden. Since Samanosuke mostly wields swords, most of these elemental orbs that Samanosuke finds in the released version of the game take the form of a sword-like weapon, ostensibly as an extension of the sword that is in Samanosuke's possession from the beginning of the game. What if Sougen was given the Shiden orb, or had it in his possession? It could be that he was using the Shiden orb to enhance his preferred weapon. Could it be that you gain the Ryzan sword by defeating the first boss? If beating the first boss of Onimusha Demon Warrior is how the player obtains the first elemental weapon, does that mean all the elemental weapons were obtained through boss battles? If all the hypotheses that I proposed up to this point turned out to be true, there would almost surely have to have been a boss fight to obtain the Koen orb, which houses the Enryu sword, and the Wind orb, which houses the Shippu sword. But another scenario is that at least one of the weapons could have been obtained through a puzzle. Murad 58 did eventually find what appear to be short GIF images and other images within the room where the first elemental orb, the Shiden orb, is obtained in the released version of the game, which seems to suggest that the Shiden orb could have been obtained through a puzzle. It could be possible that this first orb, or perhaps another orb, could have been meant to be obtained through a similar puzzle in the PS1 beta, and the beta versions of the PS2 version, with said puzzle ultimately being scrapped. Perhaps for the PS2 and Xbox versions at least, this mechanic could possibly be restored someday. In preparation for a future video in this series, I sought help from the 8 Mansions Translations Discord server in translating the subtitles from the various examples of the Onimusha beta footage and screenshots. In the process, the people in the server uncovered a plot point regarding how Samanosuke might have obtained the Oni Gauntlet. The scene in question looks like it takes place in the room where Samanosuke fights Sougen, and if the subtitles are any indication, may even take place immediately after the fight. From what Samanosuke is saying, it looks as though he has obtained the gauntlet directly from Sougen. If the narrative of Samanosuke not having any Oni abilities before the Sougen boss fight is true, as is seemingly implied by what I now know to be the Tokyo Game Show footage, I think it's at least plausible that this boss fight is how Samanosuke obtains the Oni Gauntlet. In Onimusha Warlords, Samanosuke obtains the gauntlet much earlier in the game, after a failed attempt at fighting Osric, with the Oni clan passing the gauntlet on to Samanosuke directly. The player immediately makes use of the gauntlet's initial ability, the ability to absorb souls from defeated Genma, depending on how long it would have taken to reach the Sougen boss fight. And if said boss fight was truly how the gauntlet was obtained, this change might imply that the team behind Onimusha felt the scale of difficulty for this segment of gameplay ran too high and needed to be simplified. After all, if absorbing souls was a game mechanic in the PS1 version of the game, without the gauntlet, players would not be able to absorb the yellow souls that restore health. which would leave players with just the herbs and medicines they find on the way. While restricting the soul absorption mechanic until after Samanosuke's first boss fight might have encouraged the resource management that was popularized by Capcom's earlier brand of survival horror, perhaps by the time of Onimusha's transition to the PS2, the team decided to move more towards an action-oriented direction and made changes to the story and the gameplay that would balance the difficulty towards more of an action-based focus. Another scene fragment that was translated seems to show a pair of castle guards directing Samanosuke to the presence of something at a warehouse. This something could possibly be an item. If so, there's the possibility that this item was the Oni Gauntlet. Perhaps the Saito clan had either made use of the Oni Gauntlet in the past, or had discovered it at some point and put it into storage. In one of the earlier segments, I went over how Sougen might have tunneled in and out of the ground, similar to Osric, with one of the areas he tunneled through possibly being the Saito clan armory. I propose the following scenario. At some point, not too far into the game, Samanosuke encounters a pair of guards manning a gate. Perhaps the siege of Gifu Castle by the Genma is well underway, and the castle guards need all the help they can get. So the guards direct Samanosuke to retrieve a special weapon, the Oni Gauntlet, from the Saito clan's armory. Only the gauntlet is missing when Samanosuke gets there, a mysterious tunnel in the floor. Samanosuke soon encounters a large, aggressive warrior monk, going by the name of Sougen. Not only does this adversary wield a strange electrical weapon, but he also seems to have the Oni Gauntlet that Samanosuke was looking for, fastened to his right hand. It is only after a hard-fought battle that Samanosuke obtains the Oni Gauntlet from the monk, allowing our protagonist a new advantage over the Genma.
Well, I've dragged this video out about as far as I can. I plan on making 2 or 3 more videos focusing on Onimusha beta content. Hopefully they'll get some buzz and inspire other people to dig up more information on the early versions of the Onimusha games, and the Onimusha franchise in general. Special thanks to Murad58, JURS, and Reds for their help in the research process and their footage. Another thanks to Snowy Aria and her Discord group for their help in much of the translation work.